The staff car is already burning when the second pass comes, and the road itself seems to flinch. Metal peels back from the hood, where the 8 machine guns walked across it. Half-inch rounds punching through the engine block, the fuel tank, the driver, the door on the far side, all in under a second. The car does not explode so much as come apart, throwing its doors into the hedgerow and its passengers into the ditch, and the noise arrives late, a ripping shriek that seems to come from the ground rather than the sky. Up above, the P-47 Thunderbolt is already climbing, 7 tons of Republic-built iron, hauling itself back into the haze over Normandy, its pilot craning his neck to see whether the car was worth the ammunition. Down on the road, a German staff officer lies in the wet grass with his ears ringing and his tunic torn, staring at the wreck of a vehicle that had been moving him toward the front 60 seconds earlier. He has no name for the pilot, no number for the squadron. What he knows lying there is that the open road in daylight now belongs to someone else, and that someone flies an American airplane. That officer was one of thousands, and his conclusion was one the entire German command in the West would eventually reach and write down in their own hand. Something surprised me. When I first went digging into the post-war reports these men filed for the U.S. Army. Ask a German general which American weapon he feared most, and he did not name the Sherman tank, which he outgunned. He did not name the artillery, though he respected it. Over and over, in study after study, the answer came back the same. The airplane, the fighter bomber, the thing they called the jabo. This whole story turns on that answer. And if your father or grandfather flew those missions, or fixed those engines, or loaded those guns on a muddy strip in France, this channel exists for men like him. Subscribe, hit that like button, and tell me his name in the comments, because these are exactly the stories I want to keep telling. Now let me take you back to how one word, jabo, ended up carved into the nerves of the German army. The word is a contraction. Jagdbomber, fighter bomber, shorten the way frightened men shorten things until they fit in a single shouted syllable. By the summer of 1944, the German soldier in Normandy used it the way a man uses the name of a disease. It meant the P-47 and the British Typhoon, and it meant that any movement in daylight, a motorcycle, a supply truck, a company of infantry crossing a field, a general's car on a road that had been safe for 4 years, could end in the space of a heartbeat with no warning beyond the sound of a diving engine. What made the Thunderbolt so particularly hated is worth pausing on, because it explains the officer in the ditch better than any statistic. This was an airplane built around a radial engine the size of a dining table, an engine so stubborn that pilots brought them home with entire cylinders shot away. It was heavy, it dove like a dropped anvil, and when it leveled out at treetop height and opened up with those 850 caliber guns, it laid down a wall of fire that turned a truck into scrap and a man into a memory. The Germans had good flak. They had brave pilots. What they did not have by that summer was the sky, and every soldier on that road understood the difference in his stomach. Rewind the clock on that burning car by a few minutes, and you find the whole system that killed it. The pilot had not stumbled onto the road by luck. He was flying what the Americans called armed reconnaissance, patrolling a stretch of territory with permission to hit anything military that moved, and behind him stood a machine the Germans could barely comprehend. forward air controllers, radio nets, fighter strips, bulldozed out of French farmland in a matter of days, and a supply chain feeding fuel and ammunition and fresh airplanes into the fight faster than the enemy could destroy them. The German officer in the grass saw one airplane. He did not see the 400 more behind it, or the factories in Farmingdale and Evansville turning out thunderbolts on a production line, or the tanker ships crossing the Atlantic to keep them fueled. He only saw the result, and the result was total. Field Marshal Rommel himself, the man whose road this was, would be caught on exactly such a road that July, his own staff car strafed and run off the pavement by a fighter bomber, the commander of Army Group B, left concussed in a ditch like any private. That is not a legend. That is the war those men were fighting, where a marshal and a corporal shared the same enemy and the same helplessness, both of them looking up. The officer beside the burning car climbed out of the ditch, eventually, and walked. He had learned the lesson the whole German army was learning that summer, the one their generals would spend the next decade trying to explain to their American interrogators. The sky was not neutral anymore. It had picked a side. At Neustadt, in a requisition building where captured German generals were housed and fed and quietly emptied of everything they knew, the U.S. Army Historical Division ran an operation that has no real parallel. The idea was simple and a little audacious. Rather than lock these men away, the Americans handed them pencils and paper and asked them to write the war down. Their war, from their side, in their own words, campaign by campaign. The program produced thousands of manuscripts, the foreign military studies, and it remains one of the strangest archives of the 20th century. Here were the men who had planned Barbarossa and defended Normandy, sitting at desks in captivity, reconstructing their own defeat for the enemy that had inflicted it. The interrogators were not cruel about it. They were curious. And the question underneath all the others, the one that kept surfacing in different forms, was the one that matters here. What actually beat you? You would expect 100 different answers from 100 proud men. What you get instead is a kind of grim chorus. General der Panzertruppe Fritz Bayerlein commanded the Panzer Lehr division, one of the best-equipped armored formations in the German army, and he watched it get taken apart in Normandy. Asked about the fighting, he did not lead with the American tanks, which he considered inferior to his own, or the infantry, which he considered green. He led with the sky. His division could not move by day. It could barely move at all. When Operation Cobra opened in late July, the carpet bombing that fell on his positions near Saint-Lô did something to his men that Bayerlein described in language an interrogator would not forget. He called the survivors, the ones still functioning after the bombers left, a scattering of the living among the dead, and said that those who remained were often no longer capable of fighting. That was the elite Panzer Lehr, a division built to spearhead attacks, reduced to shocked men crawling out of collapsed holes because they could not answer what came from above. The pattern held as the interrogators worked their way through the roster. Ask about the retreat across France, and the generals described columns that could only move in darkness, fuel that arrived late, or burning or not at all, reinforcements that walked to the front because the trains had been strafed to junk 200 miles behind the line. Ask about the failure of a counterattack, and again, the fighter bomber turns up as the reason the armor never reached its start line. What strikes me reading these accounts is how little the men complain about being outfought on the ground. They will argue tactics all day. They believed, many of them, that man for man and tank for tank, they were the better soldiers, and in narrow terms, they sometimes were. But the sky is where the argument stops. On the subject of American air power, the tone shifts from professional debate to something closer to helplessness. And helplessness is not a word these men used easily about themselves. There is a line that gets quoted often, and it deserves to be quoted correctly, because it comes from the very top. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, was asked after the war what he considered the decisive factors in the defeat of his armies. He named three: the Allied air power, first, then the shortage of German fuel, and the destruction of the rail network, which was itself the work of that same air power, and finally, the sheer scale of the material the Americans could put into the field. The old marshal, a man not given to flattering his enemies, put the airplane at the head of the list and let it pull the rest along behind it. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to take these statements at face value and stop thinking. Defeated generals have reasons to point at the sky. If the enemy owned the air, then no ground commander could be blamed for losing, and every mistake below could be filed under an impossible situation. Some of that is surely in these reports. Bayerlein had his own reputation to protect, and so did Rundstedt, and a bombing campaign makes a convenient thing to lose to. I have read enough of these documents to know they are not neutral. But the remarkable thing is not that a few beaten men blame the airplane. It is that so many of them, questioned separately, holding different grudges and defending different decisions, arrived at the same weapon. When your enemy's entire officer corps independently ranks the same American capability at the top of the list, that is not an excuse anymore. That is data. And the interrogators noticed. The men running the foreign military studies were building, without quite intending to, the most thorough enemy assessment of American air power ever compiled, written by the people it had been used against in the flat professional prose of soldiers, describing what killed their formations. They were not trying to praise the U.S. Army Air Forces. They were trying to explain themselves. The praise came out anyway, in the gaps, in what the generals kept returning to when they thought they were only stating facts. The next question is the harder one, and it is the one the Germans themselves could never fully answer while it was happening. What exactly was this thing that fell on them, and why could they not build one of their own? 96,000 aircraft. That is what American factories delivered in 1944 alone, in a single year, more combat airplanes than Germany built across the entire war. The number is so large, it stops meaning anything. So let me shrink it to something a man can hold. It works out to better than 250 airplanes a day. Every day, weekends included. Fighters and bombers and transports rolling off lines at Willow Run and Farmingdale and Burbank, while the sun came up and went down over a country that no enemy bomber could reach. The German officer in the ditch was not fighting a squadron. He was fighting an assembly line, and the assembly line was 2 ocean widths away from anything he could shoot at. But raw numbers are the easy part of the story and the least interesting. Any accountant can be impressed by a big figure. What the German generals could not build and could not even properly describe in their reports was the machine that connected the factory to the fighter-bomber over their heads. The nervous system, not the muscle. Start with the pilot. An American fighter pilot arriving in Normandy in the summer of 1944 had roughly 300 hours of flight training behind him before he ever saw combat. And by late in the war, that figure climbed higher still. His German counterpart, by that same summer, was often being fed into the fight with 112 hours, sometimes fewer, because the Reich had run out of fuel to train him and time to teach him. Think about what that gap means in practice. The American had burned through more aviation gasoline in practice flights than the German would see in his whole operational life. One side was rationing the very fuel the other side was spending to make mistakes safely, over Texas, where mistakes cost nothing but a written report. That is not a difference in courage. The Luftwaffe never lacked for brave men. It is a difference in the depth of the well each side was drawing from, and the American well did not appear to have a bottom. Now put that trained pilot inside the system, because the system is where the real anomaly lived. When that P-47 rolled in on the staff car, it was not hunting alone on a hunch. Behind it stood a structure the Americans had built and rebuilt through hard experience in North Africa and Sicily, and by Normandy it hummed. Forward air controllers rode with the armored columns in Sherman tanks fitted with aircraft radios, men who could look at a German gun position through the hedgerows and talk directly to the fighters circling overhead, guiding them onto the target in minutes. The Germans had nothing like it at that scale. Their air-ground coordination, when it functioned at all, ran up a chain of command and back down again, slow and formal, while the Americans had simply handed the radio to the man who could see the enemy and let him do the talking. This was the piece the foreign military studies kept circling, without ever quite naming. The generals understood they were being hit fast. They did not fully grasp that the speed came from a radio net that had cut out every middleman between the eyeball and the bomb. And underneath all of it ran the thing that made the whole apparatus possible, the part nobody makes movies about: engineers. Aviation engineer battalions that followed the front so closely, they were sometimes bulldozing runways within artillery range, scraping a fighter strip out of a Norman cow pasture in 3 or 4 days, laying down pierced steel planking and having thunderbolts operating off it before the Germans had finished pulling back. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the Americans had built or rebuilt more than 240 airfields in France. The German soldier walking his retreat by night, hiding his trucks in barns by day, was being pursued by airfields that leapfrogged forward almost as fast as he could withdraw. He could not outrun the range of the fighter bombers because the fighter bombers kept moving their homes closer to him. There is a line from one of the German studies that has stayed with me because it captures the helplessness better than any statistic I could give you. A German general, describing the impossibility of moving his forces in daylight, wrote that the Allied air forces had achieved such control that his columns felt themselves under observation from the moment they left cover, that, in his words, the enemy seemed to see everything and to be everywhere at once. He was not being poetic. He was describing from underneath what it feels like to fight a system rather than a squadron, when the reconnaissance and the radio and the fighter and the airfield all function as one organism, and you have no idea how large that organism actually is. What he was really seeing was the sum of 96,000 airplanes, 300 training hours, a radio in a tank, and a bulldozer in a cowfield, all pointed at him at the same time. That is the answer to the riddle those generals could never solve while it was happening. They kept looking for a weapon they could copy, a single machine they could out-engineer, and there wasn't one. There was a system, and you cannot copy a system with a factory. You copy it with a country. That was the part they could not build, and the part they could not forgive. By the summer of 1944, the German army in France had rewritten its own clock. Movement happened after dark. Anything with an engine and a destination waited for the sun to go down, and this was not a suggestion from headquarters, but a law enforced by the sky. Learn the way animals learn about a road, by watching what happened to the ones who crossed it in the light. A German division on the march no longer looked like an army marching. It looked like something that only existed at night and hid all day, dug in under trees, backed into barns, draped in cut branches and hay, waiting out the hours of daylight the way men wait out a storm. The word for it, in the reports, is a kind of paralysis. General Bayerlein again, because he said it plainly. His Panzer Lehr division, ordered to Normandy in early June, made its approach march under Allied air and arrived bled white before it ever reached the fighting. Vehicles burning along the roads, fuel trucks gone up in columns of black smoke that marked the route for the next flight of fighters. He lost tanks, half-tracks, and prime movers on roads 200 miles behind the front to airplanes before a single American infantryman had fired at him. By the time he closed on the line, he had left a trail of his own division scattered across the French countryside, and he had learned the same lesson the officer in the ditch learned, only at the scale of an entire elite formation. You do not move in daylight. You cannot. Think about what that does to an army built for speed. The whole German doctrine, the thing that had conquered Poland and France and driven deep into Russia, rested on movement, fast concentration, sudden shifts of armor from one point to another, the ability to appear where the enemy did not expect you. Take away the daylight, and you take away the concentration. A counterattack that needs 3 divisions arriving at the same place at the same hour becomes impossible when each division can only crawl a few miles a night and must be under cover before dawn. The Germans could still fight. What they could no longer do was maneuver, and maneuver was the thing they were good at. The Americans had not outthought them tactically so much as removed the board they played on. You can feel this in the texture of the German accounts, in the small human details they include almost by accident. Men learned to read the sky the way sailors read weather. A clear morning was a bad morning. Low cloud and rain were a mercy. The only hours a column could move with any hope of arriving whole, and German soldiers came to pray for the kind of gray, filthy weather that grounded airplanes. There is something bitter in that. An army that had once dictated the tempo of the whole continent now organized its entire existence around the hope of bad visibility and celebrated a rainstorm the way another army might celebrate reinforcements. I said earlier that helplessness is not a word these men used easily. Here is where it lives. One officer described lying in a roadside ditch through the middle of a June day, while fighter bombers worked the road ahead and behind him, unable to move his men forward, unable to pull them back, simply pinned in the dirt, waiting for darkness to give him permission to be a soldier again. The smell of it comes through in these accounts if you read enough of them. Scorched fuel, the particular reek of burning rubber and hot metal that hung over the roads of Normandy, and under it, the smell of dead horses, because the German army in 1944 still ran on horses in enormous numbers, and the horses could not be taught to hide. They died in their traces in the open, thousands of them, and they lay where they fell in the July heat, and the men who had to march past them at night remembered the smell for the rest of their lives. That is the war those generals were describing when they ranked the airplane first. Not a single dramatic bombing, though there were plenty of those, but the grinding daily fact of an army that could not use half of every day, that watched its fuel and its horses and its vehicles and its nerve burn away on roads it could not stop crossing. The Americans understood exactly what they were doing. The interdiction was deliberate, methodical, aimed at the whole circulatory system of the German defense. The bridges, the rail yards, the fuel dumps, the roads themselves. Cut the movement and the strongest tank in the world becomes a pillbox, fixed in place, waiting to be flanked by an enemy who can go where he pleases. The Panther and the Tiger were superb machines. A superb machine that cannot get to the fight is a very expensive way to lose. By the time of the retreat from Normandy in August, the thing had reached its full and terrible conclusion on the roads around Falaise, where a German army trying to escape a closing pocket was caught in the open in daylight and destroyed from the air in scenes the men who saw them never fully described because the words ran out. But that is the next part of the story. What matters here is the lesson the whole army had already absorbed by then, written into their bones over 10 weeks of summer. The daylight was not theirs anymore. It belonged, from first light to last, to the Americans, 1,650 heavy bombers. That is what came over St. Lo on the morning of July 25th, 1944. The four-engined B-24s and B-17s of the 8th Air Force, formation after formation, stacked from 12,000 feet up into a sky the German defenders could do nothing about but watch. Behind them came the mediums and the fighter bombers, and behind those the artillery. The plan was called Cobra, and its target was a rectangle of French farmland, a few thousand yards wide, held by the survivors of Panzer Lehr, the same division Bayerlein had already dragged bleeding across France. The Americans intended to drop something like 4,000 tons of bombs into that box in the space of a couple of hours. They did. Bayerlein was in his command post when it started, and what he described afterward has the quality of a man reaching for words that do not exist. The ground moved first, before the sound caught up, a rolling tremor that came up through the boots and the chest. Then the noise, which was not a series of explosions, but a single sustained roar. Thousands of detonations packed so close together that the ear could not separate them into events. Dust and smoke rose until the sun went out. Men in their holes felt the pressure of each near miss slap the air out of their lungs and pull it back over and over for 2 hours. Tanks weighing 60 tons were flipped onto their backs. Foxholes closed over the men inside them. The telephone lines that connected Bayerlein to his forward companies were cut in the first minutes and never came back, so that he sat in the noise with no idea whether he still had an army in front of him. He did not. When it lifted, Bayerlein went forward to see what remained, and this is where the language breaks. He described a moonscape The hedgerows gone, the roads erased, the fields turned to overlapping craters, and among them, his men, the ones still alive, wandering, deaf, some of them mad, unable to answer a question or hold a rifle. He put the state of his division into one sentence that the American interrogators wrote down and kept, and it belongs here in full, because no summary improves it. After an hour, Bayerlein said, I had no communication with anybody, even by radio. By noon, nothing was visible but dust and smoke. My front lines looked like the face of the moon, and at least 70% of my troops were out of action, dead, wounded, crazed, or numbed. Dead, wounded, crazed, or numbed. Look at the order. A professional soldier, cataloging his losses for the enemy years later, felt he had to invent two new categories past dead and wounded, because the ordinary vocabulary of casualties could not hold what he had seen, crazed, numbed. Those are not casualty types in any manual. They are what happens to the human nervous system when it is held under a carpet of high explosive for 2 hours and told to keep functioning. Panzer Lehr had faced Soviet artillery on the Eastern Front, the largest concentrations of guns the world had yet produced, and Bayerlein knew that fire intimately. He said this was different. Artillery came in waves you could count between. This did not stop. There was no between. And this is what the whole story has been walking toward. The bombing of Cobra was not, by the cold measure of a target analyst, efficient. A great deal of it fell on empty ground. Some of it fell short, onto American positions, killing more than 100 of their own men, including a lieutenant general, Wesley McNair, the highest-ranking American killed by enemy, or in this case friendly fire in the European War. The Americans knew the carpet was a blunt instrument. What Cobra proved was not precision. It proved that the United States could deliver such an overwhelming quantity of destruction onto a single point that precision stopped mattering, that a division could be removed from the war in a morning not by hitting each man, but by saturating the ground he stood on until the ground itself became lethal. It was a capability of a different kind, the kind a country with 96,000 airplanes a year can bring to bear that a country rationing training fuel simply cannot answer. Bayerlein tried to hold. An officer arrived from Field Marshal von Klug's headquarters with an order that the line be maintained, that not a single man fall back. Bayerlein's reply, recorded in more than one account, was the reply of a man standing in the ruins of everything doctrine had promised him. He told the messenger to go back and report that Panzer Lehr was annihilated, that the position could be held only by dead men, and that the dead were already holding it. Then, the American ground forces, the Green Infantry and the inferior tanks the Germans had been so ready to dismiss, walked through the gap where an elite panzer division used to be, and the breakout that ended the Battle of Normandy began. This is the answer to the question those generals kept circling in their quiet room at Neustadt. Ask them why they ranked American air power above every tank and gun in the West, and the honest ones did not point at a machine. They pointed at a morning near St. Lo, when the sky came apart for 2 hours, and an army that had conquered a continent came out of its holes crazed and numbed, and 70% gone, holding a line that only corpses could hold. The microphones were already running when the generals began to talk. At Trent Park, the country house north of London, where the British held their most senior German captives, the walls and the light fixtures and the billiard room mantel were wired, and the men who sat there believing themselves among gentlemen said out loud to each other, in the privacy they thought they had, the things they would never have written in an official report. British intelligence transcribed it all. Decades later, the historian Sönke Neitzel went into those files and pulled the tapes back into the light, and what they contain is the confession this whole story has been circling. Not a grudging admission drawn out under interrogation. Generals talking freely, ranking the thing themselves, arriving at the same verdict again and again without being asked. They named the sky first. It was not the Sherman, which they despised, nor American artillery, which they respected enormously. The air. Over and over, in the recorded conversations of captured German commanders, the reason the war in the West was lost comes back to the same word. And it is not a word about a weapon. It is a word about the absence of one of their own. There is a moment in the transcripts that I keep returning to. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, captured in North Africa long before Normandy, is talking with another officer about what it was like to try to fight under Allied air, and he describes it not as combat, but as a kind of impossibility. A war in which your own movement is the thing that kills you. The men around him do not argue, and that silence lands harder than anything said. In room after room, the professionals who had built the most feared army in the world sat down together, off the record as they believed, and none of them defended the Luftwaffe. None of them said, if only we had held the line here, if only the counterattack there had gone in. They said the sky was gone, and everything followed from that. From Kramer, Bayerlein, Thoma, the whole procession of them, and the argument they might have had. Was it the tanks? Was it the numbers? Was it the fuel? Simply does not happen. The consensus is total. That is what makes the tape so strange to read. You keep waiting for the dissent, and it never comes. Think about what it costs a man like that to say it. These were not defeatists. They had spent their lives inside a military culture that prized the offensive spirit, that taught that will and maneuver and the trained soldier could overcome material inferiority, that had proven it in Poland and France when they were the ones with less. To sit in an English drawing room and concede that none of it mattered in the end, that the courage and the doctrine and the superb machines were all cancelled by an enemy who simply owned the daylight. That is not a tactical observation. It is the collapse of a worldview. You can hear them working it out in real time on the tapes, reaching the conclusion and not liking it, and reaching it anyway, because they had been there, on the roads, in the ditches, under the carpet at St. Lo, and they knew. The smell would have been the last thing to leave them. I said earlier that the men who marched past the dead horses of Normandy carried the reek of it for the rest of their lives. Scorched fuel and hot metal, and the sweet rot of animals dead in their traces in the July heat. Some of the men whose voices are on those tapes had walked those roads. They had come out of France with that smell in their clothes, and now they sat in clean rooms with tea and billiard tables and hidden wires. And when they talked about why they lost, they were not talking about an abstraction. They were talking about the thing that had chased them out of cover at first light every morning for 10 weeks and left their divisions burning on roads 200 miles behind the front. This is the payoff the title promised, and I want to be precise about what it is and what it is not. It is not that the Germans admired American airplanes. Plenty of nations built good airplanes. It is that the men best qualified in the world to judge, the professional soldiers who had beaten everyone else, who knew exactly what a well-run army looked like because they had been one, sat in a room where they had no reason to lie, believing no one was listening, and independently reached the same ranking. Above the tank, above the gun, above their own doctrine and their own courage, the sky and the country that had filled it, and the fact that they could build nothing to answer it. The enemy is the witness here, and the witness is unanimous. 96,000 airplanes in a single year, a radio in a tank, a bulldozer scraping a runway out of a cow pasture in 4 days, a pilot with 300 hours who had burned more fuel in practice than his opponent would ever see. It all came down, in the end, to a handful of defeated generals in an English house, talking quietly among themselves, giving the sky its name. They called it the reason. They called it the thing that could not be fought, and they were the ones who had tried. In the winter of 1945, with the shooting in Europe barely over, the United States Army began asking the men it had captured to write the war down. The program had a dull bureaucratic name, the Foreign Military Studies, and it ran for years out of offices in Germany, where German generals sat at desks the Americans provided and produced, in their own hands, thousands of manuscripts on how they had fought and why they had lost. No interrogators leaning over them now, no wiretap in the light fixture, just a former enemy officer, a stack of paper, and a question. What beat you? They answered it the same way in prose that they had answered it in the wired rooms. Read enough of these studies, and a pattern sets in that stops being surprising and starts being monotonous. A general will spend 40 pages on terrain, on the failures of his neighbors, on the shortage of fuel, on the interference from Berlin, and then, almost as an aside, he will note that of course none of it could be executed because the movement had to be done at night. The airplane is rarely the headline. It is the assumption underneath every other complaint, the fixed condition of their war. Mention the way you would mention gravity. That is what makes the record so damning. They were not trying to flatter the Americans. Half of them plainly resented having to write for the people who had defeated them. They ranked the air weapon first anyway, because by the time you have accounted for everything else, it is the thing still standing. I think that is the strongest evidence there is, and it is strong precisely because nobody built it as evidence. A confession you extract can be doubted. A confession a man volunteers to his fellow prisoners, believing the room is empty of listeners, and then repeats years later in a signed manuscript with his name on the cover, and repeats again in his memoirs, and never once contradicts. That is not propaganda. That is testimony. The United States did not have to say a word in its own defense about the air war in the West. Its enemies said all of it, unprompted, in triplicate, across 2 decades. There is one detail in these files that I find interesting and that leads nowhere, so I will give it to you and move on. Several of the German studies include careful appendices on Allied air recognition, diagrams of how to identify a thunderbolt from below, notes on the sound a diving jabo made before you could see it. Men who had lost the war were still, on paper, teaching an army that no longer existed how to survive an air force that no longer needed to fear it. The habit outlived the reason for it. And here, the story turns on itself. Because the Germans did not simply complain about American air power. They studied it, and they drew the correct conclusion, and they wrote that conclusion into their doctrine for a war they assumed was coming next. The lesson of Normandy, spelled out in their own post-war manuals and briefings, was blunt. An army that seeds the sky cannot maneuver, cannot concentrate, cannot mass, cannot survive in daylight, and will be ground down no matter how good its tanks or its soldiers are. Build for that. Assume the enemy owns the air. Disperse, dig in, move at night, and defend against the thing that killed you last time. The men who had been crazed and numbed at Saint-Lô became, in defeat, the most credible instructors on Earth on the subject of surviving under hostile aircraft, and the Americans hired many of them to teach exactly that. The reversal is that the pupil eventually failed the same exam. 20 years after Normandy, the United States flew over the jungles of Southeast Asia with the same conviction that the sky belonged to it, and for long stretches it did. But an enemy that dispersed, that dug in, that moved at night, that hid its supply under triple canopy and refused to mass where the bombs could find it, turned out to be very hard to defeat from the air. The B-52s dropped tonnages that dwarfed anything over France, and the men on the ground below them did the thing Bayerlein's generals had prescribed. They stopped presenting a target. The country that had once removed a Panzer division from the war in a single morning spent a decade discovering that owning the daylight is not the same as owning the war, that the carpet of bombs can fall, and the enemy can simply refuse to be underneath it. The defense the Germans had drawn up against American air power worked. It just worked for someone else. None of that was visible in 1945, and none of it changes what the German record says about the West. The verdict those officers signed still stands exactly as they wrote it. Above the tank, above the gun, above their own doctrine and their own courage, the sky and the country that filled it. At Saint-Lô, the airfields were already being lengthened, while the studies were still being written. Ground crews at the forward strips loaded belts of half-inch ammunition into the wing bays before first light, topped off the fuel, chalked the day's targets on a board outside the tent. The Thunderbolts went up on schedule into a clear morning, the kind of morning the Germans had learned to dread, and turned east toward whatever was still moving on the roads.